So can I just warmly welcome everyone back to the AJE annual conference for 2021. I hope you've had a good lunch. Can I also welcome most warmly to the Association for Journalism Education, Nick Bryant, who I think we probably all know, the BBC's New York correspondent. And Nick has joined us this afternoon to have a chat about his book, but also his time as a journalist covering some of the biggest stories, I think, that have happened in the last few decades. So thank you so much for joining us, Nick, from quarantine in the south of England. Nick was mentioning he's coming to Scotland earlier on when I was chatting to him. And I meant to add, Nick, bring a sweater because it is pretty cold. So firstly, welcome, Nick. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us again. Can I also just say thanks for writing the book? I teach a module which is about news and politics, and we teach American politics, and last year we taught it a lot. But usually we have 2 or 3 weeks, and every year I always struggle to find something that I can tell the students, read this will give you a really good overview. And I have to say your book's done my job for me really successfully, so I feel I owe you a debt of gratitude. So it'll certainly be on our reading list at the University of the West of Scotland next year. I want to start at the end, actually. I'm really interested to hear why you wrote the book. But I want to start at the end because this is something that was talked about a lot in the early days of this year, that as the transition from Trump to Biden happened, that there would be this sense of a normality returning to not just Washington politics, but the world. And in your book, towards the end of it, you ask for a pause. You ask for the world to pause, or you ask for things in the USA to pause. Do you think we're in that pause at the moment? And if so, is it working out the way you thought it would?
Oh, look, the political temperature has definitely been lowered after Joe Biden took the oath of office on January the 20th. There's no question about that. There is a sense of normalcy returning to the White House. It's a conventional presidency, the sort of presidency that we had, whether it was a Republican in the Oval Office or a Democrat in the Oval Office. Norms and conventions and protocols are being observed again in a way, obviously, they weren't under Donald Trump. But that's one America. But Margaret, there's a very different America out there as well, an America that still loves Donald Trump. You know, more than 70 million people clicked on the terms and conditions of his presidency, many with great enthusiasm at the election last November. More than half of Republicans still believe that he won that election. They don't believe that Joe Biden actually achieved a legitimate victory, even though he did. I mean, it was a clear-cut victory. There was no evidence of fraud, but so many Republicans believe the conspiracy theory, the big lie, as it's called, that Donald Trump is perpetrating, that election was fraudulent, that he had the White House robbed, stolen away from him. So although on the surface, you know, Washington looks fairly normal again, certainly at the White House end of Pennsylvania Avenue, I don't think the same can be said of America. And it's kind of 2 Americas now that coalesce around. One coalesces around Biden, one coalesces around Trump. And the divisions of that America are still very deep, and they're still very angry. So although it looks like there's a sort of return to normalcy in so many ways, America remains deeply divided. The problems that gave rise to Donald Trump are not only still there, arguably COVID has made them worse. I mean, if you look at the disparities of wealth, for instance, if you look at the misinformation campaigns that were part of Trump's rise, I mean, a lot of that stuff is still around. A lot of that stuff has got worse. And we are still reporting on 2 Americas rather than one. And Joe Biden's overriding mission, as he said, was to bring this country together, to heal its wounds. Well, I just don't see how that can happen in the short term.
Do you think that, I want to go back a wee tiny bit, because what I think is really interesting, and what you do discuss in the book, is really how the Trump presidency happened. And you talk about, you know, almost that sense that Obama almost prepared for the Trump presidency. Do you think it's the case that the Trump presidency, the Trump years, prepared for the Biden presidency, or was the Biden presidency really quite out the blue?
Well, I think if you wanted to return to normalcy, Biden was your guy, wasn't he? I mean, he basically presented himself as a kind of a continuity candidate in a way, somebody who would return American life to as it was prior to the arrival of Donald Trump. And he hoped that would be attractive not only to Democrats, but obviously to Republicans who were, outraged in some instances by what Trump had done. And there weren't that many, to be honest. I mean, but there were some in the suburbs, and obviously Joe Biden targeted that. But, what the book argues is that, Trump really wasn't an aberration. Trump really shouldn't have taken us by surprise. Trump was not an historical inevitability, but he'd almost become historically inescapable by 2016. So many American trend lines kind of converged and culminated in his candidacy. And they weren't just political, they were economic, they were cultural, they were technological, they were racial, they were sociological. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, I mean, when Donald Trump said the American dream is dead, millions of Americans just believed it. They hadn't seen a bridge built to the 21st century, which was Bill Clinton's great boast. They'd seen bypasses that had circumvented their communities in the Rust Belt. They just didn't feel like they were full participants in a globalized economy. They felt like castaways in a digital economy as well. I mean, politically speaking, the Republican Party had really become the anti-Obama party. That's what really defined it. So it kind of made sense to go with the most emphatically anti-Obama candidate, and that was Donald Trump, of course, somebody who has made his political name by becoming the untitled leader of the birther movement in America, which obviously questioned falsely Barack Obama's leadership. You look at the technological changes. I mean, Trump was such a beneficiary of social media, Facebook and Twitter. It's hard to see him having a successful candidacy without those weapons and those tools in his political arsenal. And sociologically, things had changed. I mean, Americans had started living together in like-minded communities, not just attending churches where they found people who thought the same way. They'd actually actively sought them out and were living alongside them. We call it the big sort. It's one of the big sociological trends of the last 20 years in America. So that created this polarized America, which Donald Trump sort of managed to, was a beneficiary of that as well. So there were so many long-term trends. And, one of the reasons I wrote the book was, on the night that Donald Trump won, we were all trying to make sense of what had happened. But when you sort of sat back and thought about it, there were sort of historical clues. Some of them were glaring, some of them were fairly well hidden. But I wanted to write a book which really explained the rise of Donald Trump, not just going back over the sort of 2016 campaign, but really, going back 50 years to the presidency of Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm. See, just referring, you talk about the night that Trump won, and I mean, the picture you paint is probably the picture that most days, sat and observed, which was that sense of kind of this just happened. But did you get the sense that, in terms of Hillary Clinton, because you talk about her candidacy, that sense of, there was almost a sense in her campaign that she couldn't lose. But was there that sense that American politics wasn't necessarily ready for a woman, or was it just not prepared to elect Hillary Clinton?
Look, I think there was a lot of misogyny obviously directed against Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton hatred, the Hillary hatred was just so strong and so visceral. And you saw it in the Rust Belt. There was Rust Belt rage, which Donald Trump obviously managed to exploit. And there was also Hillary hatred that Donald Trump had managed to exploit. She was such a figure of hatred for a number of reasons. I mean, one was that she was a woman, I think. One was that she was just seen as a figure of the establishment. One that was that she was seen as Bill Clinton's wife. And if you look at the problems that America has now, so many of them were pregnant during the 1990s when Bill Clinton was in charge. You look at the deregulation of Wall Street, which contributed to the Great Recession. That was a Clinton problem. You look at mass incarceration, the criminal justice reforms that Bill Clinton brought in the 90s was such a part of that. You look at the deregulation of the internet. Clinton just didn't want to regulate the internet. There were so many startups failing in Silicon Valley at the start of the internet boom that government in Washington just didn't think it needed to regulate the internet. And actually, that arguably is one of the biggest policy mistakes of the last 20 years. You look at the welfare reforms, a lot of people think they actually increased poverty in America and made it harder for people who play by the rules and worked hard to actually make a decent living. So I think that was a problem as well. And if you go back to how Hillary Clinton introduced herself to the American people, which was in 1992 when her husband was running for the presidency, you remember that famous interview she did when there were the allegations of sexual infidelities. And she said, "I'm not just some woman standing by my man like Tammy Wynette." Well, that really annoyed a lot of people. And many of them, Margaret, were women. So I started by saying that misogyny was a problem, but so too was Hillary Clinton's failure to win over enough women. I mean, one of the stats that I still find amazing, which makes it almost impossible to have predicted the result in 2016, was the number of white college-educated women who voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, in the aftermath of Access Hollywood, you'd have thought that figure would be probably, 65, 70, maybe even 75%. It was actually 51%. And that speaks of Hillary's problems. She was trying to be the first female president, but she struggled to get women to actually buy into that goal.
I always found it really interesting, or the narrative around Hillary Clinton of, she stood by him, that was her choice. And there's, why did she not leave? Why did she not leave? Why did she put up with this? And I always just remember challenging some of my pals who are women by saying, well, maybe she just loved him and she just didn't want to leave him. And she was almost being judged in a separate way from perhaps she should have been. Maybe it was just as simple as that. And therefore, she was almost being held to a different standard in some respects, of this expectation that she should have made another choice, a choice that perhaps other women might have made or other people might have made. And I've always found that the narrative personally around Hillary Clinton's choices to be quite troubling from that point of view. See if we think about Trump, because obviously I think we all recognise as people who work in journalism that the news media certainly helped to contribute to the Trump story, the success, the presidency. What was it actually like on the ground? I mean, was it really that sense of, like you woke up every day just thinking, what's going to happen today?
Oh, look, it was an amazing time to be reporting America. I mean, my day would begin rolling over in bed, picking up my phone and seeing what Trump had tweeted overnight. And my day would end seeing what Trump had tweeted just before he went to bed. And, often the tweet that was so shocking at 7 o'clock in the morning would be forgotten by 9 o'clock in the morning. And that 9 o'clock tweet, which kind of, overtook the first one, would be overtaken again in 2 hours' time. So I was constantly struck by what you thought would be this big story at 7 o'clock in the morning wasn't the big story by lunchtime. And lunchtime in America for us is obviously the 6 o'clock news back here in Britain. And often by the 10 o'clock news, it had changed as well. So the news cycles just became so concertinaed. I mean, they were just coming at us at a hurtling speed. So that was very disorientating. I think the sort of barrage of misinformation that was coming out of Trump and coming out of the White House, that was very disorientating as well, especially, excuse me, if you're in a press conference with Trump. I think it was very sort of hard sometimes to fact check him in real time. And even if you exposed what was obviously a falsehood, Trump had no shame around that. So he would argue that, black was white and white was black. And I think that was very difficult. We'd never kind of dealt with that kind of presidency in the past where, there was no agreement on a basic set of facts. So that was problematic, and that was very challenging. I think, at the start of the Trump presidency, I think a few of us got together and thought this is going to be the biggest challenge we've ever faced as journalists. And I mean, a lot of us in the Washington Bureau had done wars and disasters and all that kind of thing, but we never covered a character like Trump and a kind of post-truth presidency like Trump. And journalistically, that was very difficult to contend with, especially at a time when it was not only Donald Trump that was challenging the facts, but his supporters as well. And I think that was something that was really noticeable when we sort of headed out into the other parts of America, into the Trump heartland. The level of trust in us as journalists had really fallen very sharply.
Mhm. That's interesting. That's something we were talking about earlier on today, issues around trust in journalists. Can I ask you, of all of the stories that you covered during the Trump presidency, was there anything that you covered where you were actually saying to yourself, I don't believe we're actually reporting this?
Well, that happened almost on a daily basis, I have to say. It was like an out-of-body experience at times, covering Donald Trump. And it was fascinating because early on in my New York posting, I actually met Trump. We were doing a story about casinos in Atlantic City that bore his name that were shutting their doors. And Trump did an interview with the BBC, partly because he wanted to sort of make it very clear to a global audience that he had nothing to do with these casinos anymore. So I met him. And it was really interesting. I mean, first of all, he was incredibly polite. It was a time when he really enjoyed the company of journalists rather than sort of called them fake news and saw them as enemies of the people. It's a great honor, he said, as I came to the door, and he shook my hand. He's a famous germaphobe, so I wasn't even sure whether he'd even touched me. And he was very humble. He was very lucid. He was very intelligent. He was very respectful of the BBC. I think he almost regarded it as an offshoot of the British monarchy. He was so polite, almost to the point of obsequiousness. And then the camera came on, and we saw a very different Donald Trump, the performative Donald Trump. You know, we saw the extravagant boasts. We saw the sort of colorful turns of phrase. And he was a showman on camera. And it was so interesting because when he became the president, I wondered whether we would see the Trump pre-camera coming on, you know, the kind of more sensible Trump, the more lucid Trump. And what we actually got was the performative Trump times 100. And it was kind of off the scale. And, you know, in the many analytical mistakes I made about covering Donald Trump, that was one of them. I thought when he got the presidency, the burden of the office, the tradition of the office would weigh heavier than it did. But within the first 24 hours, it became obvious that the Trump presidency, he would change it more than the presidency would change him. And you asked me about, was there a moment when I thought, wow, I just can't believe this is happening? Well, it came within 20 minutes of him taking the oath of office when he talked about American carnage. I thought, wow, this is a different world.
How do you think he will be remembered as a president?
Well, his legacy is going to be bitterly fought over and will reveal the polarization of America. If you are a Donald Trump supporter, you will point to a record of conservative achievement. And there was a record of conservative achievement. You know, 3 Supreme Court justices elevated to the bench. I mean, it's going to be a Trump court for the next 20, possibly the next 30 years. He got 3 picks. You know, the tax cuts, building part of the wall, having an America First policy, some of the trade disputes that he fought. I mean, that even for people who were suffering from the trade war, were very supportive of the trade war. They just liked the idea of an American presidency standing up to China, and they didn't believe that China had been stood up to in the 20 years since it joined the WTO. So on that side, I think, you know, there still are many millions of Americans who regard Trump as a national savior, mm-hmm. and believe that, you know, he should be still the presidency because he won the 2020 election. I mean, obviously on the other side, there are people who would regard him as the worst president that America has ever had, and somebody who trashed the traditions of the office, behaved appallingly, mm-hmm. and, you know, is good to be out of that. But yeah, I mean, people will contest his legacy, and that argument will, for the next 5, 10, maybe 20 years, mm-hmm. Define how polarized America is.
Obviously, we read, we hear, we see, you know, 2024, he could run for office again. Do you think that's likely? Do you think?
I'm not sure about that. If he wants it, I suspect he will get the Republican presidential nomination. I mean, there are still so many Trump diehards out of there. I mean, I was with him in CPAC, the conservative conference in Florida, when he kind of made his sort of comeback speech. And, you know, he spoke to a pretty devoted audience in the room, and outside there were people who were even more devoted to Trump. Some of them were veterans of January the 6th, the storming of the Capitol, and were very proud about their participation in that insurrectionary moment. And when there was a poll conducted at that conference, Donald Trump, won it easily. I'm not entirely sure he will run ultimately. I think, he won't like the possibility that he could lose again. I think some of this is about raising money. It's very useful for him to sort of dangle the possibility of a presidential run in fundraising. I also think he wants to be the kingmaker, so he doesn't want to kind of rule himself out early, because that would diminish his political power. But at the same token, I wouldn't be surprised if he did run again. And if he did run again, you can't rule out the possibility that he could win not only the Republican presidential nomination, but the presidency itself. 74 million people. I keep going back to that number. 74 million people voted for him.
Yeah.
And you can carve out, although he lost big in the popular vote, you can carve out a victory these days, as you know, in the Electoral College with those kind of numbers, if you get them in the right place. Yeah. And this was a close election. It was clear-cut in many ways. It was fair. There wasn't evidence of fraud, but only a shift of about 60 to 80,000 votes in a few states would have actually thrown the election into the House of Representatives. Nobody would have won 270 in the Electoral College. There were scenarios where there could have been a 269 split. In that instance, it would have gone to the House of Representatives. The way the Constitution works, even though the Democrats have a majority there, the Republicans actually control more state delegations, and that would have actually enabled them to elect Trump as president. So, even though it was clear cut, it was close.
Obviously, Trump, I suppose in some respects, the Trump presidency has only been one small part of the time that you've covered American politics in America. So thinking, because in the book, you go back, you start with, It's Morning Again in America and Reagan and the impact that Reagan had. But I think, what I'd be really interested to hear is what you think about Obama and his legacy. I always remember the night that Obama won, and he stood, I think it was in Chicago, and I remember thinking, the very fact that you're standing there, a man that didn't have a white face, as the next president of the United States, what else can you do that will surpass that alone? Do you think is his legacy greater or lesser than that fact that the United States elected an African American?
Yeah, I think you've put it really well, Margaret. I think the fact that he became president in racial terms ended up being more significant than his 8 years as president in racial terms. Just that historic first was always going to be the opening line in his victory, wasn't it? And whatever he did on the racial front afterwards wasn't going to be as significant or symbolic as that dramatic moment when he actually won, and we realized for the first time that a black man would occupy a White House built by slaves. That was just so massive. And of course, Obama didn't want his presidency to be defined by his pigmentation. He didn't want it to be defined by his race. And so he steered clear for most of the time of racial controversy. He didn't want to make a big race speech as he'd made during his campaign. He tended to shy away from the big racial debates. When he did get involved, they were offering fumbling. He says in his autobiography, when I did intervene in racial disputes, then my poll numbers went down. But arguably, that's a reason actually to intervene more forcefully and to use his persuasive powers on the question of race in a way that he didn't. He didn't make a big set piece speech on race, and I think a lot of African Americans are disappointed by that. In terms of his broader legacy, economically, obviously saved the American capitalist system early on, I think, with the relief bill, and there are cars still made in Detroit, partly because the Obama administration bailed out the auto industry at a time when that didn't have necessarily bipartisan support. But by the same token, by the end of his presidency, the extreme inequalities in the American economy had got worse, not better, and that was hugely problematic and contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. In terms of healthcare, obviously, he achieved something that no Democratic president has ever achieved, which is something nearing universal healthcare. That had eluded Clinton, it eluded JFK, it eluded LBJ, it eluded Truman. So that was a really big deal. But again, a lot of structural problems in the American economy, a lot of structural problems in infrastructure. Maybe America wasn't as feared internationally as it was, which again helped Donald Trump sort of create this idea of America first and a strong America and an American strongman. So it's a really sort of ambiguous legacy, which again, will be argued over for years to come, and whatever, in a very polarized way.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, can I just say to everyone who's listening, we would be delighted to have some questions rather than me asking them all. Of course, I could ask questions for the rest of the afternoon. Can I ask you just, and I'm going to say this will be my last question, but it probably won't be, because I'll just want to keep asking. So the title of the book, When America Stopped Being Great, I have to say, the other day I was wondering who's going to write the book when Britain stopped being great, but maybe that's a project for you to do next year or the following year. Do Americans think that America stopped being great, and do they care?
Do you know what, Margaret? I was really worried about how this book would be received in America. I mean, we even sort of thought about changing the title, but I said, no, we can't. I mean, we're saying this internationally, so we should say it in America as well. We shouldn't be squeamish. We shouldn't be, cowardly about this. We should just put it out there and see how it goes. And actually, the response in America has been extraordinary, because I think a lot of people have agreed with the kind of prognosis about America. I mean, it's a very pessimistic prognosis at the end. I mean, I think, some people were hoping that, there would be a happy ending to this book, and there really isn't. Because I do worry about the possibility of more American carnage. In fact, that's my final line. And, I wrote that before January the 6th. We had this interesting moment of publication. My publisher wanted to go to press on January the 5th, and I said, no, we've got to wait for January the 6th, just to see what happens. And of course, we saw that extraordinary sort of insurrectionary moment. And but that was sort of previewed in the book, that we would see this kind of political violence, we would see this continued polarization, we would see this sort of argument continuing over the outcomes of clear-cut elections. The delegitimacy of presidencies has been a trend in America now for 30 years, going back to Bill Clinton in '92, and now it's just reached this ridiculous stage where everything is contested and nobody believes anything anymore. So, no, I mean, the response in America has been, surprisingly sort of supportive of the thesis of the book, and my American friends read it, a bit depressed, but not really in any sense of disagreement, and that's been really noticeable.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Can I open the floor to some questions? A couple of people have put them in the chat, but I'm going to actually invite you to maybe ask them yourself. Ivor, you were the first one to ask a question. Do you want to come on screen and ask away?
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
I really admired your reporting from New York, Washington, particularly during the election. So do not regard this question is a devil's advocate, a chance for you to knock back some criticism. I was concerned about, particularly on the BBC's coverage, not specifically you, the long time it took you to get round to saying on screen, but that was a lie. I had the feeling that for the early years of Trump, there was a lot of pussyfooting about whether we should actually say this isn't true. So do you think on reflection that the BBC, you can only speak for them, you can't only speak for yourself, but yourself and your general impression of the BBC, were you slow to tell audiences, not just online, I'm sure it was there online, but on screen, that was not true? Now, admittedly, you did it on the stolen election, but perhaps it should have happened beforehand.
Well, look, I was never unafraid to talk about when Trump had so obviously committed a falsehood, and to point that out. I really wasn't. I think the word lie is slightly different, because when you accuse somebody of lying, you have to be convinced that they know they're lying, that they are deliberately doing so. And that gets you into the sort of psychology of Donald Trump. And what has struck me covering Trump, and it struck me in that first meeting actually with him, and I left with the impression that even though he had said things that were so obviously false, Trump believed them to be true. And if you'd have taken a lie detector test afterwards, my suspicion would be that he could have passed it. So partly for that reason, I was always reluctant to use the word lie, because lie implies certainty about the motivation. And I never thought we could be totally certain with Trump. Falsehoods we could be certain about, because they were so demonstrably easy to prove. And I think we did that. And I think we did that early on. I don't think we waited to the sort of election to do that. And there were other times, you know, we obviously had to make calls on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, under sort of quite extreme deadline pressure at some times about what we were going to say. And the big one, I think, was the racist tweets when he told the 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from. 3 of them were obviously born in America. 1 had become a naturalized American citizen in her teens. They were American. And that was, to me, obviously racist. And so I said it was racist. I was doing the White House that day. John Soper was away. And we decided to be very clear cut about that. And so anyway, I don't think we were unafraid to call it as we saw it, to be honest, is what I'm saying. And occasionally that got us into trouble. You know, I got hit by a BBC complaint that, frankly, unfairly, I thought, you know, I described Trump's boast when he gave it, and all this is a matter of public record. Trump described his handling of COVID as 10 out of 10. And I said that was a ridiculous boast. And the BBC complaints unit found against me. I had the full support of BBC News. They really fought hard for that shouldn't be adjudicated against me, but it was. But, you know,
Nick, can I just pick up? You've sort of made an interesting distinction between falsehood and lies based on your perception of whether the person telling it believes it. And I'm not sure, for a journalist, we're in a position to make that judgment. And even if we are, I'm not sure that excuses somebody like Trump, who might well believe all his lies. But have you not got an obligation to the audience to call it for what it is and not just be understanding and sympathetic because the guy was off his head and couldn't tell truths from lies?
No, I think there's a difference between falsehood and lie. And to say this isn't true, this is false, and this is a lie. I think the lie is slightly different, and you've got to be convinced every single time that the person who is telling the lie knows they're telling a lie and is deliberately telling a lie. I think that's the difference that, you know, we made in our minds.
Thank you.
But like I say, we were never unafraid to call out falsehoods.
Thank you, Ivor. I get the sense Ivor could continue this discussion for quite a long time, but we're going to move along. Kate Ironside, you've got a question that you wanted to ask Nick.
I was just thinking, you know, there's so much focus in the election on the ages of the 2 candidates. Nick, do you feel that, you know, Biden has the energy and the stamina for the presidency, and how much of an impact is Kamala Harris having?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, because I think when most of us started paying attention to the race in 2020, we were shocked and appalled, quite frankly, at Biden's energy levels. You know, I first saw him in Iowa. It was at a room. I mean, weirdly, something he said at the end to me sort of went viral in the end. It was when I asked him for a word with the BBC, and he said, "I'm Irish," and it was a sort of big smile, which has been taken as the kind of barometer of the special relationship ever since, and kind of a window on his thinking about the UK. But prior to that, we were shocked at how old Biden and energyless Biden was. I mean, he'd make these sort of speeches that were rambling soliloquies, really. The anecdotes didn't seem to make any political point. He'd see people in the audience that he recognized, and this would sort of revive a memory from years back, and he'd sort of describe where he first met them again. It was kind of so rambling and incoherent many times. And I think when he lost in Iowa really badly, I think he was 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire. I mean, those are positions that normally eliminate you from the race. But of course, he had South Carolina coming up next, where he had a big African-American constituency, a congressman in Jim Clyburn who was willing to endorse him. And that was the crucial moment, I think, of the 2020 campaign when Clyburn came out for Biden. And after that, COVID hit. So he could basically disappear and run his campaign from his basement. And that was hugely advantageous for him, because I think the more scrutiny he came under and the more people saw him in the flesh, as they did in Iowa, as they did in New Hampshire, where voters really take seriously their civic responsibility to vet the candidates, he did very poorly. But after COVID, he could basically hide away. And that was hugely beneficial to him as a candidate. As president, I think he's been sort of kept away from the press to a certain extent. But I also think it's been a sort of slightly more energetic presidency than many people predicted, and a more consequential presidency than some people predicted, and a more ambitious presidency than some people predicted. As for Kamala Harris, I think it's really interesting. I think internationally, she seems to get a lot more attention and interest than she does domestically. Again, I think a lot of people saw Kamala Harris run for the presidency herself ahead of 2020 and were pretty disappointed with what they saw. They didn't think she was kind of ready for prime time yet. She didn't really seem to have a coherent message about why she wanted to be president. And I don't think, I always think there's a bit of a discrepancy between the sort of level of excitement that she gets internationally and the level of excitement she gets domestically. And I think that's really interesting, because I think it actually hints at something internationally, which is, I think the rest of the world is looking for another Obama. And they want to have a candidate that they can sort of see the best in America in. And they see Kamala Harris as possibly that. But, you know, I don't think she's quite that kind of once in a generation politician that Barack Obama was, nowhere near.
Thanks, Nick. There's a really good question here from Helen Johnston. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in. I don't know if we'll get to them all. Helen, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to do that?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. That's fine. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I just wondered, what do you think the impact of Trump's legacy will be on the UK, or has already been on the UK?
Well, look, I think there were big parallels, weren't there, with Brexit and Trump. And that was the kind of thing about the election. We kind of factored in the Brexit factor in a way, the surprise factor. And I think many of us still sort of thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, that a kind of lopsided victory in the popular vote, and she won by 3 million, would translate into an electoral college victory, and it didn't. And I mean, I was somebody that spent so much time in the Rust Belt. If I'd spent more time in Pittsburgh, I would have had to pay local property taxes. But every time I left Pittsburgh to return to New York, I still thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. Even though I saw the Hillary hatred, I saw the Rust Belt rage, I still thought that equation, big victory in the popular vote, will translate into electoral college vote. So I got it wrong, even with the Brexit thing. Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a lot of nostalgic nationalism playing around at the moment that has influenced British politics and American politics. Clearly, there are a lot of working class voters who feel culturally divorced from people in the past who have been their sort of political allies. You think of the sort of disconnect between a metropolitan left and an old industrial left, and that same dynamic is playing out in America in the same way that it's playing out in Britain. Cultural issues are becoming more defining politically than economic issues. And that's been striking both in the UK and in America. I think also, you know, there's a sort of post-truth aspect to some politics, and I think there's also a sort of post-scandal aspect to politics now. I mean, the ability of politicians to survive scandal is really interesting, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. It's almost like scandal has become an elite concept. You know, if it aggravates the sort of chattering classes or the media elites in London or Washington and New York, it lessens the impact of that scandal more broadly. And I think that's a really interesting thing. I think journalists used to think they could sort of claim political, you know, they could end political careers with a big scandal or a big story. And because of that, thought they were big participants in the sort of political scene. And I don't think that's true to the same extent anymore, because I think, you know, this is true of Britain and America. I think journalists are so easily cast now as members of an elite and members of a liberal elite. And I think that's been a dynamic that's playing out on both sides of the Atlantic at the moment as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, because it seems that, with sort of recent scandals, it seems that nothing seems to affect the voters, does it? And like you say, as journalists, we might think that person should have been forced to resign. I mean, we've got the whole Matt Hancock thing today, and that doesn't happen anymore, does it? That nobody seems to feel that they should face the consequences of their actions.
I think it's really interesting. The scandal threshold seems to have really gone higher. I mean, and it's not just Trump. I mean, you look at Clinton. I mean, with Monica Lewinsky. I mean, I think that was one of the big moments. And I think one of the things that Clinton did very successfully, and people have used the same playbook ever since, is you immediately say, who do you want to win in this situation? Do you want my accusers to win, or do you want us to win? You immediately put it in a kind of partisan frame, and you cast your accusers as the enemy. So you basically sort of play into a sort of polarized political climate. Clinton did that so successfully with Monica Lewinsky. Donald Trump did that very successfully as well with Access Hollywood. And I think you see it to a lesser extent in other scandals that are playing out, whether they're in Britain or America.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. We've got a couple more questions. Mary Ferguson. Mary, do you want to ask your question?
Hiya. Sorry, I just get my video on. It's probably a daft question, Nick, but when I think of the swamp, well, the monster from the swamp, Mr. Trump, when he was a massive security breach with the Russians, and his friendship with his friend, the bully, Mr. Putin. He is a bully. But I just wondered, Biden, I wonder if he's strong enough to fix this. But again, you were saying that you would think Trump would re-emerge. Do you really think the American security, the government, the people responsible for the American security would allow that? I'll God strike me dead for saying this, but honestly, at some point, I really have hoped that somebody would have taken Trump out. And presidents have been cheating out for less. It's a bad thing to say, but the Americans might vote him in, the people whom he's reached out to, who have the same mindset. But he's made such a mess of the security thing that I can't see him being brought back in. Can he fix that damage that's been done, Biden?
Well, look, I don't think there's a sort of deep state out there that can prevent Trump from winning the presidency if he gets more votes in the right places. I think it just doesn't operate like that. And I mean, as for Biden, I think Biden probably would think of himself as being tougher on the international stage than Obama. I mean, one of the problems of Obama with dealing with Putin, I think, was he sometimes projected weakness. The annexation of Crimea was a classic example of that. Didn't get a huge amount of pushback from America. Maybe that emboldened Putin to start interfering more aggressively in the 2016 campaign. I mean, clearly Russian interference was a big factor. And I think Biden would see himself more as a sort of diplomatic black belt, somebody who's been on the international scene now for decades, understands international leaders. He regard foreign policy as his area. Arguably is the most highly qualified foreign policy president since George Herbert Walker Bush in the early 90s. So, Biden would regard himself as somebody who won't be pushed around to the same extent with Putin. I didn't pay, because I was partly leaving America at this very moment, packing boxes, I didn't pay as much attention to Geneva as I probably should have. But, clearly Biden would have come away from that thinking he'd sort of asserted himself, obviously far more strongly than his predecessor and perhaps more strongly than Barack Obama as well.
Thanks, Nick. Claire Wolfe, you've got a question that's probably more about the media than it is about the politicians.
Thank you. Hello. I'm just interested to know, you said that initially Trump was quite cordial towards you and then it all changed. How did the public, did their kind of reaction towards the BBC change as his kind of anti-media campaign picked up?
Yeah, that was really interesting. And it struck me early on, actually. I mean, normally when you say the BBC in America, people think of Alistair Cook and they think of, a internationally respected news organization that's beyond, unimpeachable. But increasingly over the years, in the Trump years, you encountered hostility. You know, I remember being with an evangelical Christian Uber driver in Southern California who was driving me and my family, you know, from the airport to somewhere. And we were chit-chatting away about, you know, his faith and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of the journey, he said, I just don't know why you tell so many lies. And it was kind of, what? And it was just this assumption that because I was a journalist, I was a liar. And that was the moment I thought, wow, something has really shifted. Because this was a mild-mannered guy, a kind of, you know, God-fearing bloke, the sort of guy that you come across in America a lot and are always incredibly polite to you. And the idea that he would end the journey with that kind of insult really struck me. And at that CPAC conference that I was talking about in Florida, a kind of rhetorical hostility was almost getting to be a physical hostility when we were sort of interviewing people and vox popping people, challenging them about the idea that they thought that Trump had won the election and that Biden had stolen it. You know, very quickly a mob would gather around. And, you know, thinking about that afterwards, I mean, there was some concern because, you know, January the 6th obviously had a lot of people who were carrying a lot of guns. And I think, you know, that's going to be a worry over the next few years, that when you're in a hostile Trump crowd, you know, there is the possibility of some sort of violence against you. And I mean, it's, you know, it's not something I worry about much, but it's definitely something that we should be mindful of. And of course, there was that situation where one of our cameramen got thumped, you know, a lovely guy, Ohioan, so, you know, comes from middle America, as apple pie as you could get, Ron, Skeens is his name. And he got thumped and pushed. And yeah, I worry about the possibility of that happening in the 2024 race. Is, you know, the hostility against the media has become such a big part of the Trump shtick now. It's really been noticeable that his followers are becoming a lot more hostile as well. Although it's worth saying that, you know, the majority of them are still, you know, really good towards you. They're a lot of them still sort of, it's kind of love-hate relationship I think they have with the press.
But then we had that incident in Downing Street recently as well, with you know, British reporter as well running for cover.
Yeah, that was really alarming to see, wasn't it? And
yeah,
probably, you know, we haven't quite seen that. You know, I haven't seen an equivalent, for instance, outside the White House yet.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, the crowds are definitely getting more hostile and mistrustful.
Thank you.
Can I just, we'll get some really good questions around the Republicans and the influence of Trump and, you know, other populist leaders. But can I just knit forward to Liz Hannaford's question, Liz, if you're there, because it links, I think, into what Claire's question is around journalists and also what Nick's just been talking about.
Yes, thanks, Margaret. Hi, Nick. I was just wondering, because you're working obviously alongside US journalists and you're absorbing American journalism news programs all the time. So from that perspective, what lessons do you think US journalists need to learn, or you think US journalists and news networks have learned from the way they covered the Trump presidency and indeed the elections?
Yeah, look, I think there are more lessons to learn about how we covered the 2016 campaign, because Trump sort of promised to throw a lifeline to the post-industrial landscape of the Rust Belt, but he also threw a lifeline to the kind of the wasteland of the media and news organizations that have really been struggling ever since the sort of birth of the internet and figuring out sort of revenue models and revenue streams. You know, suddenly they had this gift of the ultimate clickbait candidate. You know, somebody who guaranteed ratings. I mean, the biggest non-sports ratings that cable TV has ever had was the first presidential debate, the first Republican debate on Fox News. And far too readily, I think, we handed over airtime to Donald Trump in a way that just kind of inflated his candidacy and distorted the race. I mean, the kind of default position of CNN during 2016, if Trump wasn't speaking, it was to have an empty podium with a countdown clock saying when Trump was about to speak, you know. And I think it was Les Moonves, who was the head of CBS, a guy who's been discredited now over the sexual harassment at work. I mean, he said, you know, Trump isn't good for America, but he's great for CBS. And I think that that line really summed up the mood of much of the media. You know, they loved the vaudeville, they loved the show, they loved the reality TV because it brought in ratings and it brought in clicks and it brought in subscriptions. And I think it had a distortive effect of the amount of coverage that he received. And I also think the way that we dealt with scandal that year, you know, there was a strobe effect of the Trump scandals. There were so many Trump scandals that the press couldn't really agree on which one was going to kill him off. And I mean, finally Access Hollywood came along, and that was the moment where everybody thought he's dead, but he wasn't. And to present a kind of sense of impartiality, the scandal that everybody kept returning to was the Hillary email scandal, which, you know, was fairly small scale, really, but because there was this sense of, you know, we need to demonstrate our impartiality. So whenever we talk about Trump University or whatever the scandal was of the day, we should talk about Hillary scandal as well. So we're focused on the email scandal. So the email scandal got magnified, and there was a kind of laser effect on the email scandal, where with Trump, there were so many scandals, it was like a strobe effect. And there were so many disparate points of light that there was never any, it was never focused on one particular thing. And I think that was a problem as well, where there was this kind of false equivalence around scandal in 2016 that, yeah, I think we can learn lessons from that as well.
And do you think there is that sort of soul searching amongst US journalists or the people that employ them? Is there that sort of, you know, really interrogating, unpicking what we did, where we went wrong, if they did go wrong, and what we're going to do differently going forward? In
parts of the US media there were, but I think the prime concern about American media right now is how do we kind of, because ratings have fallen off a cliff, clicks have fallen off a cliff, traffic has fallen off a cliff. I think they're trying to figure out a business model that survives post-Trump. And I think that's the problem. And you can see, because of that, a dangerous sort of trap that whenever Trump raises his head or whenever Trump reappears on the campaign trail, you know, there will be this return to Trump, because that was generating so many sort of viewers and listeners and profits. So yeah, I think there's a danger at the moment in this kind of this sort of post-Trump slump for the US media, that, you know, they reach for the kind of, you know, the golden goose that laid all those eggs, you know.
And Biden isn't such good ratings. That's the issue. Look,
Biden's a presidency you can have on the background, and presidencies that you can have on the background are terrible for cable news in America. But, you know, presidents aren't there for our journalistic entertainment value. And but I think that's part of the problem at the moment. There are US media outlets, I mean, not serious ones, but who kind of have turned politics into a kind of slightly entertainment, slightly sports-like. And I think that's problematic when the matches aren't, you know, Biden's a kind of series of goalless draws, whereas Trump was continually sort of, you know, it was kind of goal fest after goal fest. So it's
interesting analogy.
It's a problem for the media.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Nick. Now, very conscious of time, we do have a few more questions from David, Mercy, and Kate, but I'm going to actually, I'm afraid, draw things to a close. Because we also have our next session, and I'm conscious of the fact that you know, we've spoken to Nick for far longer than we'd originally scheduled. So apologies to those people. Nick, can I just say thank you so much again for coming to speak to us. We know that you are on the cusp of just leaving the BBC, so can we wish you all the very best in whatever you choose to do. Oh, they're getting a round of applause from a few people. We really should have, when I was reading your book, I noted in the cover flap that you have a PhD. So we really should have been referring to you as doctor, seeing as you've joined the academy this afternoon. Thank you so much. Plug for your book again. I would highly recommend it. It's a great read. It is a great read. That's what I would say. And I think that you just encapsulate so much in such an enjoyable, entertaining, informative way. So thank you. It was brilliant.
Well, look, I'm so grateful that you enjoyed the book, and it's been lovely to hook up with you today. It's my second day back in Britain. I've just done my second day COVID test, and Look, and good luck with all you do. I mean, you've got such a responsibility, sort of, you know, raising the next generation of journalists. And you know, if ever I can be of any help, just drop me a note. But you know, good luck to you, and thanks for having me. And Margaret, thanks for asking that question that was asked about how come Robert Moore was in the Capitol and you weren't.
Yeah, I did dodge that one. I didn't. I was trying.
You saved my blushes.
I was trying to save your blushes.
But he's a great mate, and he did a fantastic report that day. And there are some days when you just got to say we got beat, and that was one of them. But he's a lovely fellow, Robert, and he deserved his success. So anyway, but lovely to be with you. Thank you so
much, and you are always welcome back. And hopefully, the next time we have a real live event, if you're in the same city, you can join us for a glass of wine and a canapé.
Well, that sounds fantastic.
Thanks. Thank you so much,
great.
Nick. Have a good weekend. Thank you. Bye.